Why was it so important to warriors at the end of the Bronze Age and beginning of the Iron Age to switch from bronze swords to iron swords? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now just very briefly before I go on, this is not an Iron Age sword, but it's the closest thing I've got to an Iron Age sword. This is obviously a Viking era sword, but similar size and shape of blade. Now, many of you will be familiar with Bronze Age weapons like this beautiful leaf-bladed kind of Ewart Park sword here from Neil Burridge of Bronze Age swords. Now, it's very evident these were very effective weapons in their time. However, as I guess most people will realise, at a certain point people started switching from bronze weapons to iron weapons. But why? A lot of people would assume that iron is somehow better than bronze. Is it? Maybe not in the way that you think. So let's dispense with the shield for a minute. We'll come back to that in a second because it is an important part of the equation here. So most people assume that the reason that people moved from bronze to iron is simply that iron is a better metal for weapons. It's certainly got more potential by turning it into steel with the addition of carbon. But what a lot of people don't realise, I don't think, is they don't realise that actually bronze weapons are really, really effective and can be, in some circumstances, harder at the edge than some iron weapons. So they make the assumption that people simply moved from bronze to iron because iron made a better blade, was harder, more durable, this kind of thing. Not quite that simple. So let's set some background context here. First of all, bronze is made primarily of copper and tin. There are some other things like lead and other things mixed in very often in bronze for certain purposes, for example, to make it pour more easily and things like this. But primarily it's copper plus tin. Brass, in case you're wondering, would be copper plus zinc. So bronze, copper and tin. First of all, to make bronze, you have to have access to copper and tin. So the first thing when people start talking about the end of the Bronze Age, as it were, is the fact that bronze, copper and tin specifically can be somewhat difficult to obtain if you live in areas which don't have ready access to either copper and or tin. Famously, I think, the certain areas of Britain, for example, Cornwall, are famous for producing tin, which might possibly, I think there's been a little bit perhaps made too much of this, but it's possibly one reason why the Romans came to Britain in the first place was to get access to tin, but also other things as well. So, to make bronze, you could say, is perhaps more difficult than to make iron, because iron ore is basically everywhere. It's obviously more prevalent in some places. Some places are very famous for their iron, like certain bits of Sweden or Germany or Spain, or indeed bits of Britain as well. So iron can be found absolutely everywhere, okay, and through lots of different means. I mean, you can literally just pull it off the surface of the ground in some places. So you could say that iron, and this is the route that some people go down, you could say that iron weapons took over because they were more accessible and easy to produce for a greater variety of people all over the planet. I'm not sure I totally buy that idea because there are some places which had access to loads of bronze. In fact, Britain, where I am now, was famous for making bronze weapons and exported them all over the place. There, you know, clearly there were enough bronze weapons, spearheads and axes and swords around in Europe for all the soldiers who needed them. So I'm not sure that I totally buy that argument. Moreover, if that was the only explanation, if it was simply that iron was more readily available, then what you might expect is you might expect the common soldiers to have iron weapons, but maybe the high status ones to retain bronze weapons, if it was only about that. So it's clearly about more things than that. So is iron inherently better than bronze? Well, I would say no, within certain parameters. So if you're talking about something like a spearhead or an axe or a relatively short sword or medium-sized sword like this, then you could argue that in some ways bronze is better than iron because it can be cast, okay, which means you can get very complex shapes. Now, anybody who studies Bronze Age weapons, be it spears, axes, swords, daggers, or so-called rapiers, you will see that the Bronze Age weapons are often very much more complex in their blade shape and cross-section and everything else, certainly than Iron Age weapons are. Now, obviously, steel weapons centuries later gained this level of complexity again, but really we don't see spearheads and sword blades as complex as we've seen in the late Bronze Age until way later, into basically Renaissance times, okay, things like the Cinque Terre and stuff. When we look at the complexity of both edge forms and the fullering and the cross sections and the midribs and everything else, these swords really reached a higher level of evolution with bronze because they could be cast, and those shapes are far more troublesome and time consuming to make via the medium of forging, which of course is what you have to do with iron. So the simple act of putting a fuller or groove up a blade with an iron or steel blade is way more work than if you simply make a clay or stone mould and cast it. Okay, so in terms of the shape of the blade and the form of the blade, bronze actually has a lot of advantages. Now let's talk about edge hardness. So I'm not going to get into the sort of Rockwell's or Vickers measures of measuring hardness, but it has been demonstrated through numerous tests that if you work harden the edge of a bronze blade and you make it of the correct balance of metals for the alloy, and you compare it to a wrought iron blade as found in the Iron Age at the beginning before they'd worked out steel and heat treatment and all that kind of stuff, in some cases the bronze can actually have a harder edge than the iron blade. So edge hardness, it's not to do with that either. So is it maybe something to do with the durability? Well, bronze can be broken, but fundamentally bronze, if you bend it, it bends. An iron blade, if you bend it, it bends. We're not yet into these super brittle materials. Now, admittedly, a piece of iron you can bend more times without it work hardening and stress fracturing and breaking than bronze. So you could possibly argue that a blade can be bent and straightened more times if it's made of iron than if it's made of bronze. And in fact, there's this famous quote, of course, that the Romans say that the Britons used to get bent blades and used to straighten them repeatedly, and they weren't therefore a very good temper, unlike the Roman swords, presumably. So we could perhaps extrapolate back and say this did also happen with bronze blades, and admittedly, if you were doing that and repeatedly bending a blade and straightening it, it is possible that a bronze blade might crack and break. But if it does, that's not a disaster, because a iron blade that breaks can't easily be forged back into one piece. Whereas a bronze blade, you just melt it down, turn it to liquid, pour it into a new mould, and Bob's your uncle, you've got a new sword. So bringing this full circle, recyclability, bronze can be recycled over and over and over and over again. Iron, actually, in the period anyway, nowadays it can, but in the period, iron can't really be recycled into blades in the same way that bronze can. So all of these things said, why do I think is the principal reason that high status warriors, the equivalent of knights, chieftains, thanes of their time, why do I think they would have wanted to move from a bronze sword, which was technically really effective for being used as a sword, to an iron sword? Well, I think all of these previous factors mentioned can play a part, but I think there's one most important factor, and that is length. Now, I'm not saying that size always matters. We'll come back to that point in a second. However, by and large, there is a maximum size that you can make effective bronze weapons. Why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. In order to make a bronze sword, it has to have a certain statistics to it, has to have a certain thickness to it, but equally there's the structure of the metal itself. And we find that you just don't commonly get, there are some large bronze swords, but you don't commonly get bronze swords above a certain size because the material doesn't really, and the way that you have to make a blade of that material doesn't really favour blades much bigger really than about that. Okay, so there is a maximum size and therefore reach to this type of sword. Now, before I go on to the advantages of having a longer blade and why they would want that, I'm going to point out that some people, famously the Romans, did like short swords. Absolutely, if you're using a massive shield like the Roman scutum, then something that's about the size of a gladius or smaller can work very, very well because you've got the protection conferred by the large scutum. Moreover, the large scutum is designed to be used in groups of soldiers in a very coordinated and specific way. And in that situation where you're forming a structure of shields, a short sword makes a lot of sense and can even be advantageous in that kind of formation. But it seems that earlier tribal groupings of people in Iron Age Britain or Gaul or Iberia didn't, by and large, fight like that. They, on the other hand, used longer swords and different types of shields. In fact, all across Northern Europe, various peoples in what became Germany and France and Britain and Spain of today, and Scandinavia as well, they preferred to use swords with blades actually of a very similar size and shape to what they were still using in the Viking Age. Okay, so Iron Age long swords were commented on by numerous Roman period authors, and they were very different to the typical Roman gladius. And by and large, they were used with centre boss-gripped shields, some of them like this Viking era shield here, which is going to be a stand-in for an earlier Iron Age shield. But even if we go back to the Bronze Age, we find shields not unlike this, essentially large targes, usually not quite as large as this. And yes, by the Iron Age, they were reacting perhaps to influence from Gallic armies and also from the Romans themselves, and using longer, more oblong shields, sometimes oval, sometimes rectangular or coffin-shaped. So they did have larger shields, but they don't seem to have fought in the same way as the Roman legions did, and they used longer swords, they fought in more open formations, and perhaps they fought with a more individualistic mindset. So why would the Iron Age person prefer to have a blade of this kind of size and reach and length rather than this? Well, I already mentioned the word there, reach, which isn't entirely explained by how you might think. So from a very simplistic point of view, if I'm using this Bronze Age sword here, clearly if I want to cut at someone's head, I've got to be closer. If I want to get down to their leg, I've got to be closer. If I'm using a longer bladed sword in contrast, then I can do that from further away, either to high or low targets. Sometimes that means that I can get to low targets, which I wouldn't be able to reach with a shorter blade. So it basically means that I can hit more parts of the opponent. And legs are a very important target when fighting with shields, coming underneath the shield and indeed getting underneath to the body as well. So greater reach sword versus sword is important and is an advantage in single combat. But there's an even bigger reason, and that is behind me. It always comes back to spears, folks, okay? So the queen of weapons might be the sword, but the king of weapons is the spear. And the fact is that combat, whether you were Roman or whether you were Gallic or Germanic or Britain at this time, really combat was, warfare anyway, was dictated by two main factors. One was spears and the other was missile weapons like bows, sometimes slings. So if most infantry, their primary weapon is a spear, okay, what you're primarily dealing with is long-range thrusting attacks underarm or sometimes overarm or indeed thrown, okay? And remember that the thrown spear is a very important thing. It's one of the reasons as well why the overhand grip was used so much. One, because it gets it above the heads of your compadres who are either side and behind you. It means you can thrust down over the top of the opponent's shields without getting tangled up with your friend's shields and in fact coming over the opponent's defensive lines. But also from this position, at any instant, I can instantly launch and throw the spear into someone's face or even below their shield down at their legs. Okay, so it's a very potent attacking position. This is the primary weapon. Now that being the case, if you have either thrown, broken, lost, been disarmed of your spear, your secondary weapon is your sword. Now, in that situation, actually, sword and shield is a pretty good balancer to the awesomeness and the reach of the spear. What you want to do is cover the line and get in as quick as possible. You want to cover distance because the spear has superior reach on you. But If you have a spear and a sword, the tactic therefore is essentially trying to cover the line of that spear, trying to bind that spear shaft and charge in and get the person as quickly as possible with your sword. And that is more easily done with a sword with a longer sword rather, with a longer bladed sword like the Iron Age sword, for two main reasons. One, you can reach them from further away. So when you're fighting a spearman, you are not going to be able to reach them when they can reach you. So they are going to be stabbing at you at a time when, with a cut or a thrust, you can't yet reach them. They have a longer weapon, they can outreach you. Clearly, the longer you can make this blade, the less of a disparity that is. So by having a longer blade, not only can you cover the spear and now sooner or more quickly reach them with your sword or hit them in the spear arm with a longer blade, so that's an advantage, but there's a second thing which often gets overlooked. So I mentioned about legs being a target. So when you have any kind of shield, often when you're trying to defend yourself, or indeed when you're fighting someone else with a shield, it becomes a matter of coming over or under the shield. So the shield covers this part of you really well. If an attack comes over, I have to move my shield up. If an attack comes below, I've got two options. I can either move the shield down, or I can move my lower body. I know I'm off camera here, but I can move my lower body away while keeping the shield there, which we call slipping the legs or slipping the belly in some cases. So the opponent is trying to come either over my shield or under my shield. Okay, so I'm constantly trying to deal with that at the same time as trying to do the same to them. If they've got a spear and they're trying to come over or under, and I've got a short blade here, then I can cover myself above really easily. But if they come below, I've really got to rely almost entirely on slipping or moving away the lower half of my body. My sword can't reach down very quickly and easily to defend my legs because it's short. If, however, I have a longer blade and a spearman thrusts below my shield, I always have the option now with a longer blade to reach it and defend my legs because my blade is that much longer and can defend my legs better. So, let's conclude. Before we approach any questions of which is better out of bronze and iron and why did sword blades become longer in the Iron Age, we always have to remember the background context of what were the things these swords were being used with. The spear is still the primary weapon. The shield is still the other primary weapon. These are the main weapons of either your Bronze Age or your Iron Age warrior. That's the first thing. The next thing we have to think about is how are they fighting? They're not fighting like Roman legions, at least as far as we know. They're fighting in a more tribal, loose formation way. And this is described by Roman and Greek sources, for example. And in that situation, one-on-one, the longer blade has an advantage over the shorter blade. Might not always be the case when you bring armour into the equation, for example, in a gladiatorial context. Indeed, it might not always be the case if you're talking about shield formations, where you've got such a large shield that you can cram yourselves in tight and go into the enemy, and a short sword might be an advantage in that situation. But when you're fighting in a loose formation or 1 versus 1, long sword usually beats short sword. However, what we really have to think about here is that what the sword and shield man would usually be facing, statistically, most of the time, is not another person with a sword and a shield. It would usually be another person with a spear and shield. And against a spear and shield, the shorter blade, in my opinion and my experience, and we've done this in plenty of sparring, is not as advantageous as the longer blade. Simply having the shield and a longer blade enables you to engage the spear from further away, protect more of your body with less movement because the blade's longer and can cover more of your height, and reach the swordsman, whether it just be their hand or whether it be their head or leg or whatever, sooner than the shorter blade. So I think that this is the real reason why, when iron became available, people turned their back on these beautifully designed, very complex designed swords, in many ways superior in design from the Bronze Age, because the new material gave them one massive advantage: reach. Simple as that. Reach and length. Okay? So that's why I think people moved to Iron Age longer bladed swords and away from the shorter Bronze period swords, is because of the advantage of reach. Despite the fact that in some material terms, bronze actually has a lot of advantages over iron, even if iron has some advantages like its availability all around the world and the fact that you can bend it and straighten it lots of times, probably more times than bronze, although I haven't tested that, but I strongly suspect that's the case. So there are some other smaller factors, but I think primarily from a warrior's point of view, why would a single warrior move away from this and move over to this? It's all about the reach. So I'm sorry to say the conclusion is length does matter. There we go. On that bombshell, I'm going to finish there. I hope this has been interesting. Do you disagree? That's absolutely fine. Disagree down in the comments. Do you think there's things I overlooked and other factors that should be thrown in here as well? Again, I'm all ears and ready to hear that down below in the comments. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel again really soon. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.